Well, good evening, everybody. Nice to have you with us. And I'm ready to play another concert for you, this time entitled Scott Joplin and His Pupils. So we're going to talk a lot about the King of Ragtime, probably play a lot of his music, and also the music of his piano students and some of his other close associates. I started thinking about this over a week ago. I keep getting inspiration for my virtual concerts from different places. And I was listening to the old NPR radio show that Terry Waldo did in the 1970s. And he did an episode called Scott Joplin's Pupils. So that's kind of where I got the idea for this. And he did over 20 or 30 episodes of that show. It was really wonderful. And I hadn't listened to it in years. But anyhow, I realized I can make a whole concert out of this. And Scott Joplin seems to have had an enormous impact on most of the other musicians that he was associated with. He must have been a good teacher, a good collaborative musician. That's what I think. And forgive me for doing something that's so ragtime centric again, but what can I say? I love it. So here we go. And I'm going to start with a tune that I have never performed before. This was written by Brun Campbell, sometimes called the Ragtime Kid. He left home when he was 16 years old to go study piano with Scott Joplin, and was probably one of the first people to play Maple Leaf Rag. You heard me play one of his pieces last week called Chestnut Street in the 90s. About 2 days ago, I decided, you know what, I really need to do another one. So I sat down and learned this by ear, which is not something I do very often, but I think it's come out pretty good. And this is probably one of the best records that Brun Campbell ever made outside of Chestnut Street in the 90s. This is called Essay in Ragtime by Brun Campbell. Thank you very much. That's Essay in Ragtime by Brun Campbell. And as you can tell, that's very early ragtime. I discussed folk ragtime last week. Brun Campbell was one of the prime exponents of that style. And it's really probably the way they played way back in the 1890s. And there aren't many examples of recordings of pianists from that period. And it probably wasn't all as sophisticated as you would think in those days. Brun Campbell traveled the country, played as an itinerant pianist in saloons for not all that long, maybe 10 or 15 years, and then he became a barber and moved out to California. But he did have some neat stories about Scott Joplin. I think he played piano for Buffalo Bill. You know, there were some stories like that that he told in his old age that were really neat. And so that's Essay in Ragtime. And of course, I'll be happy to take some requests tonight. As always, I'll probably have plenty of room for that in tonight's concert. And in fact, I'll try and squeeze in a lot. I imagine many of you are quite familiar with Scott Joplin's music, so I probably know at least a dozen of his pieces by heart that we can do tonight. Let me get out my list. Yeah, and so the very next piece I'm going to play was written by one of Scott Joplin's early piano students from his days in Sedalia, Missouri in the 1890s. His name was Scott Hayden, and he wrote a number of pieces with Joplin that are very joyful. I think this one is one of the best, and it was published in 1901. It's called Sunflower Slow Drag by Scott Joplin and Scott Hayden. Well, thank you so much. Sunflower Slow Drag. A number of Joplin's pieces were called slow drag instead of rag or two-step. And with those pieces, I try not to play them a million miles an hour. It doesn't mean as slow as a funeral dirge, as some classical musicians might try and tell you, but it just means a little bit slower than a really fast rag. That's my interpretation of what Joplin put on his music when he said it's never right to play ragtime fast. And we're not entirely sure that that was Scott Joplin. It certainly could have been the music publisher John Stark. We just don't know. Now I'm going to play a really neat piece for you, which I have, again, another one I've never performed before. This is the only surviving solo composition by Scott Hayden, the great ragtimer of the early years who worked so much with Scott Joplin. And Ragtime Bob Darch is a name that I bet many of you know, one of the ragtime revivalists of the 50s and 60s, went to meet some of Scott Hayden's family, and they gave him a lead sheet to a surviving melody by Scott Hayden. And now exactly how much of this melody is really by Scott Hayden, we don't know. Bob Darch completed the piece and probably harmonized the entire thing himself. It's a lot like Calliope Rag. He got a lead sheet or manuscript of some kind from the family of the composer and then completed it. And the piece was published in the book They All Played Ragtime. And it did not come out until the third edition of the book in 1966, but the discovery of the piece dates to at least the year 1960, because Bob Darch recorded it on his first record for, I think it was United Artists that Burl Ives produced. And I noticed that the arrangement that's in the book is quite different than the way Bob Darch played it. This is kind of unusual. I'm going to have to do my best to read this music. It has 5 sections instead of 3 or 4 like most rags. And on the last section, it changes from the key of A flat to E flat. Instead of going to the subdominant like usual, it goes to the dominant, which is kind of odd. But anyhow, I think you'll like the piece. I hope so. Just as another representation of the music of Scott Hayden, arranged by Bob Darch. This is called Pear Blossoms. Thank you very much, folks. Well, that's the first time I've ever performed Pear Blossoms. You don't hear that rag very often. And it's quite interesting, actually. Bob Darch did a good job on this. But I'm sure at least the first or second section, the melody probably came from a lead sheet by Scott Hayden. Let me read some of the chat here and see what people think about this. Odd tune. I did find its history on the internet. Yeah. And there's certainly some question as to how much of that is really by Scott Hayden, and the same is true with Calliope Rag, which is also written in part by Bob Darch. He did know the family of those composers. They were still living in the 1950s and 60s. So I imagine he did get manuscripts from them, but just how much of that is the original composers, I don't know. Well, I'm so glad to have all of you with us tonight, and I hope you really enjoy this kind of music. And if you do, I accept virtual tips for these concerts. All you have to do is send in a tip on PayPal or Venmo, just like we were in person. And the information for both PayPal and Venmo should be in the postings on all three websites, in the chat, and everywhere. Kelly, I've never played Bethina. I'm afraid I don't know that by heart. In fact, I've never played any of the Joplin waltzes. Maybe that should be one of the next pieces I learn, is a Joplin waltz. I think my favorite is probably Pleasant Moments. It's a little more upbeat than Bethina, although that one is beautiful. Well, go ahead and send in some requests now, folks. It doesn't hurt to do it right away, because I will kind of have to think about it for a minute and make sure I remember the tunes, and it takes a minute for the chat to come through online. And I have a list here, of course, of other things that I'm going to play as we go through the rest of the concert tonight. Heliotrope Bouquet. Yeah, I'm going to be doing that in a little while. And I could play Calliope Rag. Oh, hey there, Nathan. I'm just reading your comment on Facebook. I agree about the tempo of ragtime. Okay, everything's good. Sorry about that. At least you caught some of that request, anyway. Let's continue with the music of Tom Turpin. I'm going to mention several times tonight Traber Tishner, who was the great ragtimer from St. Louis. I mentioned him a number of times last week, and Traber had a very successful career as not only a ragtime pianist, but collector and historian. He started in the early 1960s playing with the St. Louis Ragtimers on the Goldenrod Showboat. And I was lucky to get to know him in his later years. And I remember him telling me of all the ragtimers that he would like to have met, if he could go back in a time machine, it would have been Tom Turpin. And the people that he knew in St. Louis years ago that had known Tom Turpin were often surprised to find out he even played the piano, because he was a businessman and a saloon keeper. And so I thought I would play one of the Turpin rags for you, which I have not performed very often. And this is called the Buffalo Rag. Now here's my original copy of it, which I believe is from 1904. This was recorded by some of the banjo players of the period. I just recently learned it to perform it myself with my friend Jerron Paxton when we were in Sedalia, Missouri. So anyhow, now we're going to do the Buffalo Rag by Tom Turpin. And I don't really need the music, but just in case. very much. Buffalo Rag. I'm lucky to have an original copy of that. Since I've learned Buffalo Rag, I think I know all of the Turpin rags by heart. There's only about 5 of them. There's Harlem Rag, Bowery Buck, Ragtime Nightmare, St. Louis Rag, and Buffalo Rag. I think that's all of them. And there is also one surviving Turpin song from World War I, which it's not politically correct. It's called When Sambo Goes to France. But that's the only other piece of music he wrote that survived. I see some comments here in the chat about the Scott Joplin Festival in Sedalia, Missouri. You won't be disappointed. Well, I certainly agree with you, Jim. It was a lot of fun this year. That event has meant a lot to me. And it's funny just how many of the original ragtime players happen to live in Sedalia, Missouri. Again, I think it's because they were associated with Scott Joplin. And Joplin must have had a great influence on these other people that he worked with. And so I'd like to tell you quite a bit about one of the other ones. And he's probably the most successful of all of Joplin's piano students. His name was Arthur Marshall. And I'm going to go ahead and play the piece that he wrote with Joplin, which is probably considered the best. And it came out in 1900, but according to interviews, they were working on the piece in 1899. So this was probably written in Sedalia too. And it's most likely that Joplin wrote the third part of the piece. The rest is pretty clearly the work of Arthur Marshall. From 1900, the Swipesy Cakewalk. Here we go. Thank you so much. Swipesy Cakewalk. A lot of people think American music started in New Orleans with the Jazz Age, but it really started in Sedalia, Missouri, the cradle of classic ragtime. Now let's do another piece by Arthur Marshall. I should tell you the story of Swipesy Cakewalk. First, there is no such word as Swipesy. Joplin and Marshall were standing in the music publisher's office, John Stark's music company, and they saw a boy in the street swipe a newspaper. So then they decided, we'll call it Swipesy. That's the story of that. And now another piece by Arthur Marshall, which I believe came out in 1907 or thereabouts, maybe 1908, and it was dedicated at the top of the music to Scott Joplin. And this is called Ham and, no eggs, just Ham and in Ragtime, I think is kind of the subtitle. The idea being that it would be like a diner order. When they order ham and in a diner, that's how they would say it. That's the way Marshall described the title. Ham and by Arthur Marshall. Thank you very much. Ham and by Arthur Marshall. Now let me tell you a little bit of a story, if you'll bear with me. In 1959, Ragtime Bob Darch was scheduled to play several concerts celebrating ragtime music in Sedalia, Missouri. That is when the Sedalia ragtime music renaissance really began, was with Bob Darch in the late 50s. And Traber Tishner, who would have been about 19 years old at that time, suggested that Darch get in contact with Arthur Marshall, who was living over in Kansas City, and bring him to Sedalia to interview him and ask him to play. So they did that, and fortunately Traber made a reel-to-reel tape of the performance. And originally, I think there were 2 tapes, and one of them was lost over the years. I was able to get a copy of the surviving tape from Traber before he died. And it's really wonderful to hear Marshall's voice and hear him say so many nice things about Scott Joplin, just what a warm personality he had. He also said that they treated him as kind of a daddy to all the other piano players in Sedalia. And on that tape, he plays a little bit of a piece of music, which I'll play for you now. The full score was not published until years later in Terry Waldo's book, This Is Ragtime, and looks like that was in 1976. And the title is Little Jack's Rag. So this is a surviving piece by Marshall that was not published during the original ragtime years. And I think Little Jack was maybe a nickname for his daughter, something like that. I'd have to check the book again to be sure. So maybe somebody else can do that for me. But for now, here, I'm going to play Little Jack's Rag by Arthur Marshall. Little Jack's Rag. Thank you very much. Marshall's music has a really unique quality to it. The last section in each one of his rags, it always just makes you want to stomp your foot. And that's the case with that piece. I don't know why that's true. I feel the same way about Marshall's Lily Queen. And I do plan to play that on a future broadcast, but I haven't learned it yet. I have one more piece that I can play for you by Arthur Marshall, since I know it by heart. So I thought it would be kind of fun to do this again. This comes from the same tape that Trey Petitioner made in Sedalia in 1959. In addition to a little bit of Little Jack's Rag, he plays part of an unknown piece of music. And there's one 32 measure section and one section that's only about 8 bars. But what I did is I rearranged it, fleshed it out. I made it longer so that it's more worth performing. And I had the music typeset. Vincent Johnson has been typesetting sheet music for me with vintage music font, and he creates covers for the music, and I now sell this sheet music on my website. Now here's the piece I'm about to play for you, and it's my own arrangement of it. There's probably one or two more little things I need to say. Oh, well, on the tape, it's almost impossible to discern exactly what the title is because the audio quality on the tape just isn't good enough. Now, when I first talked to Trevor about it, he called it the P Picker. So that's what's on the cover of the music. But I think I've since realized the title is probably a key tickler, meaning tickle the ivories. But because that's what Trevor called it, that's what I decided to use as the title of my arrangement of the piece. And I was also the first person to ever record this piece on CD. Gustavo, I think I just answered your question there, yeah. This is where the title came from. The P Picker by Arthur Marshall. And the introduction is almost the same as Little Jack's Rag. Thank you very much. You know, even if the title of the piece is The Key Tickler, the P Picker fits in with the other titles of Arthur Marshall's pieces. It's great, like Hammond and The Peach. You know, it just kind of fits in. And so that's what Trevor called it. So there's that piece, and you can get that along with a few other pieces of sheet music on my website if you want to try your hand at playing these things. I see a request here on YouTube from Rare Drop for a piece of music that I was planning to play anyway, so let's do it right now. This is one of the most fascinating collaborations in the history of ragtime music. One of the most legendary players whose music really barely survives except for this one piece. There are two other ragtime songs with lyrics that he wrote that survived. I'm not going to play those for you. This is the really remarkable one. And his name was Louis Chavan, and he played in St. Louis at the Rosebud, and apparently he was the most remarkable of all the ragtimers of that period. He could play anything by ear, and they said he would play it in difficult keys like B natural. And sadly, he died, I think, in 1908 when he was just barely in his 20s. And so Scott Joplin took two themes that he wrote, the first two sections of this piece, Louis Chavan, and completed it. Joplin wrote the second two sections, sections 3 and 4. And so it's called Heliotrope Bouquet, a slow drag two-step from 1907 by Scott Joplin and Louis Chavan. I didn't show you the original copy. Here it is. I'm so lucky to have found this. This came out of the Johnny Maddox collection. Heliotrope Bouquet. Thank you so much. Heliotrope Bouquet. That's one of the most remarkable pieces to me in the ragtime repertoire. The second section sounds very much like something that Siobhan might have played in a saloon, you know, or a house of ill repute. It really has a lot of jazz feeling to it. In fact, the same melody was used in the 1920s for a tune called Heebie Jeebies, which was recorded by Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five. It's either Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five or his Hot Seven. Anyway, I love that piece. Siobhan's music fascinates me, and it's such a shame that he never made any recordings and didn't live longer. But that's how it was in those days. I might be spoiling the surprise, but on a future broadcast, I'm going to try and play something that I bet no one has performed in about 120 years, which is a piece of music by Scott Joplin's brother, Robert Joplin. And this music was only discovered recently. The historians have found that there are about 2 or 3 pieces surviving by Robert Joplin. You see, Scott Joplin didn't only play the piano. He toured the country, he played fiddle, he sang in a barbershop quartet. It was called the Texas Medley Quartet, and his brother Robert was in the group. Kind of strange it was called a quartet when it had 8 guys, but that's beside the point. They toured all over the country, and so Joplin played cornet or trumpet as well, I believe. You know, he was a multifaceted musician, and I think it would be neat to play one of these pieces by Robert Joplin. The Robert Joplin sheet music was in the collection of David Jason, and so I do want to do a tribute to the late Dave Jason at some point in the near future. I'm waiting until the family is done with probate on his sheet music collection so that it will be appropriate for me to play some music from his collection. That's the holdup on that. I'm going to continue waiting so that I can do that. I knew Dave for a number of years, and he's one of the most important historians of not only ragtime, but of all of American popular music. And so that's going to be fun in the future. Now, for the time being, I'm going to do something else for you. That's a little bit of a treat. Those of you that have been here before, oh dear, something just happened that I did not expect to happen, but I can probably fix it. Oh dear. Yeah, let's see. I'm gonna play a player piano roll for you, if I can get it to work. What's going on here is that this is a recut piano roll, and so it has 2 pieces on the same roll, and I fast forwarded to the second piece to play the piano roll for you, but the paper has gotten screwed up here. Let me just see. You know what I might do? Well, no, it looks like it's going to hold. Just give me a minute here. Let's see. I have to pump it. This is a 1913 Apollo player piano. Wow! Okay, and I'm going to demonstrate a couple of the piano rolls that were hand-played by Scott Joplin himself. So just let me rewind this slowly to about the middle point. And so for those of you that don't know, Scott Joplin made about 7 or 8 hand-played player piano rolls just a year before he died. And it's questionable just how authentic they are. Of course, piano rolls can be edited. But back to the story of the time that Trey Tishner interviewed Arthur Marshall. He played some of the Joplin piano rolls for Marshall, and he said, "Do these sound like Mr. Joplin?" And he pointed out some of the left-hand octave runs that you will hear in these piano rolls, and Marshall said, you've got the right rolls, all right. So that kind of lends some authenticity to them. And anyhow, so I thought the first roll I would play is another collaboration that Joplin wrote with his early piano student, Scott Hayden, from the pieces from 1903. But isn't it interesting that Joplin thought it was a good enough piece, he was still playing it and recorded it on a hand-played player piano roll in 1916. This is Something Doing by Joplin and Hayden, hand-played by Scott Joplin himself. well, there's Something Doing by Scott Joplin and Scott Hayden. Well, I'm reading the chat here on YouTube. Loretta says, he's playing pretty fast. Well, I picked the tempo. That's not how player piano rolls work. I picked the tempo. But, you know, a couple of the octave runs, a couple of the little additions in the music there may have been by Joplin himself. It's really impossible to tell at this point in history. And I'm going to play one more for you. I have so many piano rolls that I can play throughout future virtual concerts. But considering that we're talking so much about Scott Joplin tonight, I thought it would be neat to play some of his hand-played rolls. Of course, I've heard all of them dozens and dozens of times, but I figured there's maybe some of you that didn't even realize he cut piano rolls. And sadly, it was about a year before he died, by which time he was probably already quite ill with syphilis. So his piano playing probably wasn't that great. Most of the people that remembered Joplin himself playing said that he really wasn't that great of a piano player. He was more gifted as a composer. What did I do? Here we go. Now this one is extra special. And personally, of course, I have played this piece so many thousands of times, I don't feel the need to perform it right now, but I'm going to play from my original copy, Maple Leaf Rag, hand-played by Scott Joplin himself on the Connorized piano roll, about 1916. And my parents found this for me in an antique store. It's the only one original of the Joplin rolls that I've ever found. So it was quite a nice find, thanks to my parents. And I thought the roll's in good enough shape. I have no qualms playing it for you. Maple Leaf Rag, played by Scott Joplin. There we go, Maple Leaf Rag. I forgot there was one big tear that had been taped I probably shouldn't have played it from the original roll. But my virtual concert audiences are special, so I like to share things like this with you. Such as when I also played my original piano roll of Joplin's Silver Swan Rag. That's one of the rarest rolls in my collection, I'm sure, along with Les Copeland's Texas Blues. Okay. Well, it's well past 7 o'clock here in Durango, Colorado, so usually I mention a second time that I do accept virtual tips for these concerts. I hope I keep getting new listeners, and I hope that you continue to enjoy this method of performing. If you do, and you can leave a virtual tip, it's very helpful to me in my career. If you enjoy this kind of music, there's both PayPal and Venmo, and if you don't trust PayPal, I don't blame you. I had some trouble with Venmo myself recently. I don't need to go into all the details, but there's also a P.O. box on my website for checks, so I thank all of you very much. And please go ahead and send in some requests. I don't have much left on my list that I was planning to play for you tonight, so please go ahead and send in some requests, and I will try and get to them. I could play the Silver Swan Rag roll if you really wanted to hear that, because it's sitting right here by my desk. Let me check all the websites. I haven't checked Facebook or Twitch very much tonight. Oh, isn't that neat? I'm reading a comment here from Larry Melton, who is one of the founders of the Scott Joplin Festival in Sedalia. He says, during the last concert of the first Joplin Ragtime Festival, Dick Zimmerman played the Maple Leaf Rag Roll Joplin cut with only a spotlight on the grand piano on stage. It brought the house down. That's pretty neat. Aha! Calliope Rag. I did forget that, Amy. Let me go ahead and play that for you now. Calliope Rag. Okay. Earlier in the program, we did Pear Blossoms, which is the Scott Hayden piece that Bob Darch discovered. Now we'll do one by James Scott. Now, I don't know that researchers have found much evidence that Scott Joplin and James Scott knew each other, but in those days, I think it's pretty safe to assume most of those guys did know each other. The only one that didn't know most of the other piano players was Joseph Lamb, because he was not a performer. He only ever played one public performance in his whole life. There might have been a few other smaller things like at local churches or something, I'm not sure. I think he did minstrel shows in the 1930s, but that's beside the point. We're going to do James Scott's Calliope Rag, written in part by Bob Darch. you very much. And if you're really Southern, it's Calliope. It's a terrific piece. It's kind of like Pear Blossoms. I don't care how much of it was really written by James Scott. It's a great piece, and it's fun to play. That could be true. Someone says, I believe QRS still has Joplin's rolls in their catalog. That's quite possible. Conori's must have been a subdivision of QRS, or maybe QRS bought them out. Conori's Piano Roll Company. I could get this Silver Swan roll out and play that for you. I also saw a request for some of Joseph Lamb's music. I think what I want to do is end tonight's concert with a couple of Joseph Lamb's pieces. And in the meantime, I could use another request or two. Keep sending them in. Might be nice to do a ragtime song just for variety, since I've been doing so many instrumental rags the last 2 weeks. And while I wait for some requests to come in, I haven't announced next week's virtual concert yet. I've decided I'm going to do the 1940s concert. So I'm going to do one more in my Music by Decade series, music from 1940 to 49. I'll start with a big continuous 30-minute medley, just like the kind of things that Johnny Maddox used to do when he was playing in the old nightclubs. And it will all be music from the 1940s. And in the second half of the program, I'll be happy to play a lot of requests. And I may even go into the 1950s a bit, just to fill out the concert. So that's what's coming next week, Music by Decade from 1940 to 49. I will not be doing a 1950s concert. That gets into too much rock and roll, truly. The easy winners might be kind of nice. That's a little bit slower. And I haven't played any Joplin pieces that that he wrote him by himself tonight. I don't think I have. Let me do the easy winners. I see a request for that here on YouTube, and so I think I'll play that for you now. This goes back to Joplin's early years. Personally, I like the early Joplin best because I think the music is very happy. But here from 1901 is the easy winners. Thank you very much. The Easy Winners, one of the beautiful Joplin rags of the early 1900s, 1901. Well, unless I see anything else, let me check all the websites here. Got an interesting question here from Andrew Ratajic up in Michigan. He says, he asks, are there any rare or unfinished songs that Joplin worked on? Yeah, there is one that was discovered years later. It's quite fascinating. It was discovered in a photograph of Joplin's piano. I think, hold on, getting this roll. I think Reginald Robinson is the one who discovered it. He took a magnifying glass and he was able to read the notes of the sheet music sitting on the photograph of the piano. And so there's about a page of Joplin's music that is untitled, and it has been recorded and so forth. But that's one of the few. And on a future concert, if I can get the music from Sam Carter in New York, I'm going to try and play one of the songs written by Joplin's brother, Robert Joplin. Would be kind of interesting. Well, now, I got a request for this. Let me do it, because this is one of my most prized piano rolls. Here is the original roll of the Silver Swan Rag by Scott Joplin. Grammatically, it's the Silver Swan, comma, rag. And this is not hand-played, for those of you who are not, I know you're all player piano experts. This is not hand-played. But what's unique about this, first of all, there's only about 5 original copies of this that survive in the world. And what's interesting about it is that the music was never published. It only survived through the player piano roll. And the roll was released in 1914. So now one of Joplin's later pieces, which is quite haunting and beautiful, even though it's a piano roll. I'm going to play one more roll for you. I don't normally try and do this too much. I feel like if I'm asking for all of you to send in tips, I should be playing the piano myself and working for it. But I'm going to play one more. This was released on the master record and QRS. The Silver Swan, a rag by Scott Joplin. Hopefully I've got the tracking lined up all right. Might need to double check that real quick. Yep, okay. Rag by Scott Joplin. I think that's about the second or third time I've played that piano roll on a virtual concert, so I probably won't play it too many more times. This is an extremely expensive piano roll, and I don't want to damage the original paper. It'd be nice to get a recut of this. As a piano roll collector, I'm equally happy with recuts as I am the original copies most of the time. Something like this is extraordinarily special, but the recuts are safer to play. I feel less like I'm going to damage the paper on the rolls. And the prearranged rolls they're really often just as good as the hand-played ones. Personally, I prefer the hand-played rolls, but some of the arranged rolls can be really terrific too. Now, if anybody has requests, I could use one more that would be really helpful to fill out tonight's concert. No, I've never played anything from Treemonisha. Yeah, it is a beautiful piece, isn't it? I just found the piano roll on eBay. That's how I got that. It came from a collector in Texas. I don't know Original Rags, I don't know Fig Leaf, I don't know Sensation Rag. Wild Cherries, I could play that, but I feel like that would be kind of out of place in tonight's concert. And I'm going to be finishing with 2 Joseph Lamb pieces. Somebody name me something by a composer besides Joseph Lamb, and I'll see what I can do. A waltz. You know, a waltz would be nice. Solace, I don't know that by heart. You know, I've played it on one of the other virtual concerts, but I have to have the sheet music in front of me. James Scott. I could do another James Scott rag. You know, maybe that would be appropriate. I know what I'm going to play for you. Let's do the New Era Rag. I've done this one for a number of years. It's fun, and again, I like to go kind of chronologically through my concerts. And so this is called the New Era Rag from 1919, and it was undoubtedly because jazz was taking over by 1919. But this is truly a classic rag. In fact, James Scott was the last of the classic rag writers and continued publishing classic rags until 1922. This one is from a few years earlier. The New Era Rag. era rag. Thank you very much, folks. I saw a few requests for sensation rag. I should learn that. I've just never played it. But I would like to talk about the wonderful composer who wrote that piece, Joseph Lamb. Now, he actually started writing rags about 1903 or so. We have manuscripts of his pieces dating back that far. But he didn't have any of his ragtime piano pieces published until he met Scott Joplin. This is the story as Joseph Lamb himself told it. He was in John Stark's music publishing company in New York, and he was standing there talking to Mrs. Stark, saying how much he admired Scott Joplin's music. And he said, boy, you know, there's a guy I'd sure love to meet, Scott Joplin. I admire his music very much. And Mrs. Stark said, well, here he is. And he was sitting in the office, and poor Joplin had gout. But he and Joseph Lamb became good friends. And Joplin helped Lamb get Sensation Rag published. His name is on it, but he really did not have anything to do with composing the piece. And it's unlikely he had anything to do with arranging it either. So that's a little bit about how Joplin influenced Joseph Lamb. And I'm going to play, I only know two of the Lamb pieces by heart, and I'm going to play them both for you. Now from 1915, first, Ragtime Nightingale. Ragtime Nightingale. Thank you very much, folks. Someone noticed that I did borrow a little bit of that arrangement from the late John Arpin. I think he made the classic rags sound more beautiful than almost anyone else. In fact, John told me that he had met Joseph Lamb when Lamb came to Toronto in the late 1950s, which is just fascinating to me. So now we're going to do the other piece that I just love so much from 1919. It was the last piece that Joe Lamb had published during the original ragtime era. This is the Bohemia Rag, complete with a marching band-like flourish at the end. Thank you so much, folks. I appreciate all of you listening tonight. Thank you so much for your support with the virtual tips. And I will be back next Sunday night with another virtual concert on all three websites, this time entitled Music by Decade 1940 to 1949. Thank you for your attention to this great classic ragtime tonight. Good night, and see you next week, folks. Thanks so much.